federal government is planning a major overhaul of the environmental review process, streamlining the way big pipelines and mining projects will get approvals. The plan, they say, is to cut duplication and to fix time frames at a maximum of 2 years for an assessment. Raising some questions. Will this regulatory overhaul speed up the environmental review process and create more jobs and economic wealth? Or does the plan bow to big oil and gas companies and muzzle advocates for ecological protection? Let's find out. From Toronto now, the Minister of Natural Resources, Joe Oliver, is with me. Minister, good to have you.
Well, very happy to be here, Evan.
You and I have talked about this for a while. Explain how the government will determine which projects require federal assessment and which will just require provincial consideration.
Well, look, this project, as you know, is designed to enhance the environmental protection and move the projects along, because we have some $500 billion in projects over the next 10 years contemplated, and we want to see those projects that meet the environmental standards move ahead for the benefit of Canadians. The National Energy Board will continue to review the major pipelines, and the federal government therefore will be involved exclusively. When we talk about provincial reviews, we're talking about projects that will be reviewed under the auspices of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and there has been many processes which have been duplicative, where the federal government and the provincial governments have both had reviews going on at the same or similar periods of time. That hasn't enhanced the regulatory protection, but what it has done is create additional delays and a lot more cost. Well, what we want to do here, what we want to do is give those provinces that have adequate capacity to have the option of doing the environmental review themselves. I mean,
some of the concerns of that, for example, and you remember the Fish Lake incident where, the environmental minister at the time, Jim Prentice, refused to grant this, but when it was turned over to the provinces, BC said it would. And some environmentalists say, look, environmental assessment crosses boundaries. It should be in the federal jurisdiction. And if you make amendments to this to let the provinces do it, the standards will not be up to federal regulation. So the feds should do it, Fish Lake being a good example. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say to that is that the legislation contemplates a substitution of the provincial for the federal review only when the provinces have the capacity, which they demonstrate is directly equal to the capacity that the federal government has.
How do you determine that? I only ask you that because that prosperity mine, which is on Fish Lake, where again Jim Prentice turned it down, but BC approved it. So who sets the standard here?
Well, what we're saying is that we only have one regulatory body that will do the environmental assessment, and that will be either the federal or the provincial. We really don't need both.
But and what about this 2-year timeline? How did you come up with this 24 months? What's the magic of the 2-year timeline there? What if there needs to be longer timelines?
Well, look, we came up with it. We started by having a conversation with the president of the National Energy Board, Gaétan Caron, who has a great deal of experience in these matters, and he said that 18 months is adequate for review by the National Energy Board. And since there isn't a pre-hearing process involved in the National Energy Board, when we looked at an appropriate time for the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, we said, okay, we'll make it 24 months for that. That is enough time, in our view, in the view of experts, to complete a scientific, independent analysis to determine whether the project will be safe for Canadians and safe for the environment. It will also be enough time for people with a direct interest to express their views, as well, of course, as having a robust consultation process with Aboriginals.
But by the same token, some people say the environmental impact statements, they take a long time. You're dealing with very complicated projects. They have, there's a couple issues. One, just determining the impact, for example, in the oil sands, which, let's face it, is critical to this, both from an economic development side and an environmental side. It's complicated. And two, the jurisdiction to whom the greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental impacts are not just linked to that province. They cross borders to other provinces and they affect all Canadians. So how do you let that get out of the hands of the feds?
Well, look, you've raised a number of issues. First of all, I have a lot of confidence when I hear from experts, including the president of the National Energy Board, when he says that there's an adequate amount of time. And of course, the time does not include the time that is going to be taken up by the proponents to get ready to make the submission. This was an assertion made by the NDP, and it's simply not correct. It doesn't include that time. It only includes the time from when the process starts. Any additional time that the proponent would have to take would be in addition to that. What we're talking about here are projects that are handled, that can be handled by the provinces because it's within their jurisdiction and they have the capability. And for the big interprovincial projects, of course, the federal government will continue to be the regulator.
Unless they're interprovincial in terms of their effect, right? The outputs are interprovincial.
Well,
let's be honest. Pollution or environmental effects doesn't respect provincial boundaries. The air doesn't have a boundary.
Well, here you're raising another very important issue, and that's what the scope of the hearing should be. Now, what you should understand is the Northern Gateway process right now, under the current rules, has been confined by the regulator to the direct impact of the project. It does not go into the issue of greenhouse gas emissions or global warming, nor should it. It's important that those other issues, which are significant issues, be handled in a public forum, but not in the context of a regulatory hearing related to a specific infrastructure project.
Minister, let me show you what the Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, had to say about the changes to the environmental review process. Listen to this.
To say that projects will just proceed where basically the federal government says we're passing this down to the province to look after this environmental impact, I doubt that this is actually living up to what the Canadian Constitution requires of the federal government in terms of environmental protection.
She's referring specifically, let's say, to fish and the habitat protection, that you've got to protect that. That's federal responsibility. So in the name of efficiency, you can't offload federal responsibility. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to comment directly on fish habitat. My colleague, Keith Ashfield, the Minister of Fisheries, will be making a statement fairly soon about that, and I will leave it to him to talk about it. But this is an area of potential joint federal-provincial jurisdiction. There is no constitutional issue at all, as the leader of the Green Party suggests. We're not going to be reducing environmental protection. It's actually a bit insulting to the individual provinces who have their own robust, competent, scientific evaluations to suggest that they somehow can't do the job, that they're not capable of doing it is really, I think, not well, there were,
look, there were 40 agencies that used to do it. Now you're reducing it to 3. One last question, though.
Well, no, just a minute. I'm talking, those are federal agencies, and we're combining them into 3. I think that the point is duplicative reviews doesn't enhance investor protection. And, as the Prime Minister said, the length of time a process takes, should not be confused with scientific rigor.
But more assessment also shouldn't be confused necessarily with duplication. Some of them are different. So, we've got to be careful what we're doing here. One last question, though.
We've been very careful
about directly affected parties. Who will have a standing in the review process? You're saying only directly affected parties. And then you have been on the forefront of this, calling environmental group radicals over the Northern Gateway pipeline. So I guess my question to you, Minister, is who determines who is directly affected by a big energy project? Who makes that determination? Who gets standing and who doesn't?
Well, first of all, let me repeat what I said on your program, and I don't think it necessarily penetrated, and that is that I have never said that all environmental groups are radical, and I don't say it now, and I never believed in it, and I don't believe it now.
You said some radical groups.
But there are some radical groups, and there's no question.
Well, you mentioned Tides Canada. That's why it's not. I mean, I don't know if that penetrated, but Tides Canada was something that you did mention, right?
Yes, I did, and but I'm talking about a limited number who have a radical agenda, who are opposed to any form of development of our resources, and while they claim they aren't, they oppose every one of them. So what we're talking about here, though, in the context of the hearings, is the fact that the people who ought to have a right to be heard are those who would be directly affected by the project in question.
But I guess who defines that? I mean, there are some people that say all Canadians are directly affected by a pipeline. Who decides who's directly affected? That would be a critical determination.
Yeah, well, that would be done by the regulatory board in question.
All right, it's going to be fascinating how this rolls out, and you can imagine there's all sorts of reaction on both sides, by the way, on this. It's a very important issue. The Natural Resources Minister, Joe Oliver, always comes on Power and Politics. I appreciate your time, sir.
You're most welcome.
Natural Resource Minister Joe Oliver just told us that his plan is streamline environmental assessments, will cut red tape, it will stop groups attempting to game the system by tripping up the process. That's his view. Critics insist the new changes will fast-track the critical steps needed to properly understand the environmental impact of major development projects. Question, is the federal government putting corporate interests ahead of protecting the environment, or are they simply streamlining a cumbersome process? NDP environment critic Megan Leslie joins us from Halifax, and the Liberal Natural Resources critic David McGuinty is with me here in Ottawa. Good to see both of you. Now, we had Joe Oliver on, and he said, look, we're going to have a one project, one review, Megan Leslie, more predictable and timely reviews, less duplication in the reviewing projects, and stronger environmental protection and enhanced consultation with Aboriginals. That's what they want to do. What's your view?
Well, no one will deny that there are problems with the assessment process, and the Environment Committee actually studied the assessment process recently and heard all kinds of testimony about how to improve it. But if you're looking at improving it, gutting it is not the answer. We saw a cut to the Environmental Assessment Agency in this last budget. Now they're being expected to do the assessments that are more complex, faster, and with fewer resources. We heard excellent testimony at committee saying, well, and some of this testimony was actually from industry. They said, if you want faster review processes, properly fund the Environmental Assessment Agency. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's a very simple solution, and this is one that actually did come from industry. So just saying, look, there's a timeline. If it doesn't fit in, then it's out. We're gonna axe consultation. We're going to go after environmental charities in the budget and axe dissent. We're going to axe science by cutting back Environment Canada. I mean, this is all setting it up to be a pipeline budget, pipelines at any cost. But we do need to consider the impacts on the environment. I find it very interesting that it was the Minister of Natural Resources making this announcement today and not the Minister of Environment. It seems that environmental protection just doesn't matter here.
David McGuinty, your reaction again. Just to remind our viewers, one project, one review system for major economic projects, as long as they are up to the standard of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. They have a bar. They say that's the bar. What's your view on that?
I listened to the minister very carefully, and I think his words were, when it comes to what he calls the substitutability of this, having the provinces do a federal assessment. Yeah. He said, as long as the province has, quote, as long as the province has the capability.
That's right.
Well, I'm not sure how you judge that or how you assess that, and I don't know to what extent provinces are going to accept to receive these references and take this on. Look, here's what's really happened here. Megan's right. There's improvements to be made. We can always improve the regulatory system. But instead of actually working with the provinces and coming up with a comprehensive agreement where we can make sure we have a strong national environmental assessment system, where we can avoid duplication, sometimes triplication, instead of doing that hard, heavy lifting, Evan, which is what I've been calling for 5 years, they just came out and announced this in a budget bill, that they intend to make these changes. You asked them about the 2-year deadline, this 2-year drop-dead date.
24-month, that's right. Just again, there's 24-month review period for major projects. That's right.
Well, 18 months is about right for the average project of the National Energy Board. But if you look around internationally and you try to find another jurisdiction where they've got these arbitrary timelines, you can't find them. Because here's what really happens. A lot of the times, the delay is on the side of the company that's proposing the project. because they haven't got their research done, they don't have their analysis done.
Their environmental impact statements.
Right, and so they can't actually accelerate it any faster. It takes time to get the
data. But there's a
data.
practical side here, and I'll ask both of you. The government cites a number of projects from the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and say, look, when these assessments go on for 4, 5, 6, 7, 20 years, you end up undermining the investors' confidence in the process, and you undermine the actual project itself. So is there a way to make this more efficient without necessarily a hard cap at 24 months, or is that the answer? Megan Leslie.
David used the word arbitrary timeline, or phrase arbitrary timeline. I absolutely agree with him on that. I did a little bit of an analysis of some of the recent assessments, and a lot of them do fall into the timelines that the government has put forward. But what about the ones that don't? The ones that don't, I don't think should just be cut short because they've gone beyond the timeline. Sometimes there are very serious issues that have to be dealt with. There's consultation issues. Sometimes, like you said, it's the proponent or the company that actually hasn't gotten their documents in time. The Minister of Natural Resources keeps citing the Jocelyn project as taking years and years and years. In that example, it was the company that wasn't getting their information into the process.
But I understand that, but what's a realistic timeline? I mean, it's easy. You know, the government says these are going on too long. There are 40 federal departments going on. So what's realistic here? I'll get with David McGuinty.
Well, first of all, I think it is important to note that I think we can make progress when it comes to the number of interveners who are participating in these panels. You know, when you get it to the 4,000, 5,000 names on a list who want to testify, look, you know, I conducted a lot of processes around the country in a different career, and you don't necessarily need to hear from 4,000 folks to exhaust the arguments and exhaust the analysis that the panel really should hear. But that's going to be very interesting to watch carefully.
But I got to get an answer, because the government's put answers, and it's easy to criticize if you don't have a counter proposal. They're saying 24 months, and that's their time. What's a realistic timeline? David McGuinty.
Well, here's what I think we should do. First of all, we should take this legislation out of the budget bill. We should introduce separate legislation, and then we should immediately have this legislation sent to a legislative committee of the House. And folks like Megan, myself, folks from the government and all sides can sit down, and we can bring in the actual practitioners of this system and say, what do you think works? What do you need to see to get a streamlined and better system? In industry, what do you think? And
well, they say they consult and they came up with 24 months.
Listen, we've just been doing 10 months of hearings at the Natural Resources Committee. There's been nothing on this at all. This has been very much a smoke and mirrors game, and there's a lot of other subjects here that we should have a full airing of.
All right, and Megan Leslie, what's the number? I mean, let's get practical.
Yeah.
What's the number?
I'd say why does there have to be a number? I say that an environmental assessment should be assessing the environmental impacts, and that we should look at environmental protection. 2 years ago, on this Friday, it's the 2-year anniversary of the spill, the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. What do we want to do? I think we've got one shot to get this right. We do the analysis, we figure out what the environmental implications are, and we deal with it now, not down at the end when there's this massive spill and we have to spend billions of dollars cleaning up the mess. We've got one shot here. It's not about arbitrary timelines. It's about having an efficient process, and there are ways to do that, to do a proper analysis about the environmental impacts and prevent these spills.
But you gotta, I mean, in the end of the day, you gotta put something concrete on the table. And David McGuinty, you said 4,000 interveners may be too much. The government's saying whoever gets only people directly affected, to be determined. I don't know the definition of it. Do you have a definition of who should be allowed to have standing at a review?
Well, the minister said directly affected parties. And earlier today, I think somewhere else, he said you had to have expertise. So I would say if you apply his logic, then maybe the president and CEO of Total France, that just took 6 years to get a project in the oil sands, doesn't have the requisite expertise and certainly doesn't live near the project. Maybe he shouldn't be able to testify. Look, you need to have an arm's length objective process here. And when you start corralling or curtailing who can speak on the basis that they don't live in that area, which raises another important question here, Evan, and that's the question of climate change. The minister said very clearly he doesn't want to see climate change, and his own plan, by the way, to reduce greenhouse gases by 18%, he doesn't want to see that addressed in any of these assessments. I don't know how you do that.
Well, we'll talk about that. Megan, I got 30 seconds. I want one other thing they've done. New financial penalties. Fines from $100,000 to $400,000 will be imposed on businesses or individuals who violate environmental regulations. They say that gives teeth for enforcement. Your view on that? Do you agree with that?
I think it's great that they're raising fines, absolutely. What I want to make sure happens, though, is we actually do enforcement and follow up on violations. The Environment Commissioner this fall said that I think it was 7% of violations were followed up by the National Energy Board. It's time for us to actually crack down on this.
I don't think we've heard the end of this, so there's lots more details. Minister Oliver said we'll hear from the Fisheries Minister. We'll find out what happens with habitat issues for fish. Yeah. Federal jurisdiction, we'll find out about that. There's lots to come on this. We'll hear from the Environment Minister, of course, on this as well. But for now, I got to put an end to today's discussion with NDP Environment Critic Megan Leslie and Liberal Natural Resources Critic David McGuinty. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.